I would like to thank our sponsor, Calibre Wings, who produce detailed scale die-cast models that strive to deliver a detailed experience that incorporates light weathering and colour toning that start from their Wave 3 models. This is finally bundled into a nice collector's box with dedicated illustrative box art to match. To purchase the models that have been shown, please visit calibrewings.com. Thank you. So Tim, when did you first become interested in aviation?
It's a very interesting story, that, because I was born in the Sudan in East Africa, and one day when I was about age 3 or 4, probably about 4 I think, my father said, let's go up to Wadi Halfa where we were living at the time, which is now of course underwater as a result of the Aswan Dam, and we went into this sort of basic control tower with this great long sand runway, and I was standing in the control tower when suddenly these 2 aircraft came in at high speed and beat the hell out of the control tower, and then switched around and landed and taxied in, and they were 2 Mosquito fighters.
Wow.
And I remember now quite clearly the pilot and his navigator in both aircraft getting out, and they were all wearing a flying scarf that was over their shoulders like this, wearing their bundu boots and their khaki flying suits, and they walked into the control tower. And then when they had completed what they had to do, they took off again and beat the hell out of the control tower, I mean really low. And I turned around to my father, and I can remember saying, that is what I want to be. I want to be a fighter pilot in the RAF. And I've never veered from that particular feeling. And then I suppose a few years later on, probably when I was about 11 or 12, I went to watch a film called Reach for the Sky, when Douglas Bader was made. And I then realised I also would like to go to Cranwell. I didn't want to lose my legs, but I certainly thought that was for me. And so my whole ambition at school from then on was to be a pilot, to go through the Royal Air Force College at Cranwell, and then to fly fighters in the Royal Air Force. So that's how it all started.
Brilliant. So what year did you join the RAF?
1961, September, I think was the 16th, when we entered the Royal Air Force College at Cranwell as young cadets, just like Douglas Bader did, all having to wear our trilby hats and sports jackets on. And we were met at Grantham railway station by the sergeant, and then taken to the college where we were inducted into the system, and then from then onwards the training began.
So what aircraft did you actually start training on?
Well, I had never flown at this stage properly at all, other than civilian aircraft. And a great friend of mine, who was also on my entry at Cranwell, called John Allison, was already a private pilot, and he commandeered the Flying Club's Tiger Moth, and took me for my first flight ever in a Tiger Moth, and I've never forgotten it to this day. And he's still a good friend of mine, and we have a lovely photograph of us coming in to either beat hell out of the grass airstrip at Cranwell, or it was coming to land, I don't know which. And then we started after I think it was 4 months at the college, we were then allowed to go and do flights in Chipmunks. And I started flying the Chipmunk with my flying instructor, a chap called Brian Henwood, who is still a good friend of mine today. And I can remember being so airsick, it's unbelievable. As soon as that cartridge fired in the Chipmunk, I started to feel really queasy, and actually was queasy for some considerable time. But Brian, being a fabulous flying instructor, kept going with me. And then, of course, I'd finished that, and we didn't start flying the Jet Probus, which was our basic trainer, until 1.5 years into the college, which was a long time to wait. And then, as I started flying that, Brian Henwood, I think it was because of me, but he certainly came across, and I rejoined me as my flying instructor on the Jet Probus. So he then took me through the whole of Jet Probus flying training. Didn't find it very easy, but Brian, being the super bloke that he was and a very fine instructor, coaxed me through the course, and eventually I passed out and got my wings. Not passed out literally, but passed the course and got my wings.
We also had a pretty eventful thing happen to you. You ejected in your very early career, didn't you?
Yes, when I went, I was selected to become a flying instructor, which was not my wish at all, because I wanted to go on fighters, as I already said. I arrived at RAF Sarston, and I was flying with my student in those days called Mike Sedman, who's still a very personal friend, and indeed we celebrated our 50th anniversary of our ejection when we went back to the village where it actually happened, and they put on a very good display for us. But yes, it was teaching him, I think, exercise 19, which was spinning, and we climbed out of our procedural climbing lane at RAF Sarsen. I can remember the degrees, 305 degrees, and as we entered into cloud, with my student on the left-hand side and myself on the right, suddenly, as we came out this cloud, he shouted, "Formation, sir!" And I remember pulling on the control column, and I understand it was about 12:13 G. I pulled the aircraft into the vertical position when we collided with what happened to be the leader of the Viper Red aerobatic team, which we had from RAF Sarsen, and there were 4 aircraft doing a card 4. If you can imagine the 4 of spades, it was the leading right-hand edge one where the leader was, and we hit him, and he immediately ejected, as did my student, although we didn't get out initially because as the aircraft was cut in half just behind the cockpit, Mike, who was still there, sitting there beside me, I eventually shouted at him, but of course I had my mask on, so I eventually went to take it off when suddenly he pulled the ejection seat and out he went. And I followed him not long after that. And then during my descent, I landed in the pub roof, the only pub in a village called Loughborough. And but the wind was 30 knots, very strong wind for parachuting, and I went into the side at this side of the pub, which then pulled me up as the parachute went over, and then the parachute wrapped itself around a motor car that was going along the road, and I then thumped down onto the road beside the car. And in those days you could have bright blue bone domes I had on, a visor cover down here, the mask and the oxygen tube, which looks all crinkly, and white skinned flying gloves. And the chap in the car, when I eventually lifted the parachute off the side of his window there, was absolutely terrified. He had his mouth wide open and his wife beside him. And I can remember him telling me now, because he came to see me in the hospital, he said, "I thought it was a bloody Martian." He said, he had this blue head, black eyes, and proboscis hanging down here. And I was only about 21 then, and in the back seat was his 18 year old daughter, who was a really beautiful looking girl. And all I had to say when I took the mask off, "God, she's a cracker." But then he came to visit me in hospital, and it just so happened he was driving his daughter to Nottingham University for the first time, and then eventually he came to visit me in Noxon Hall because we had to be there for 6 months lying on boards recovering. And but I asked him, why haven't you brought your daughter? And he said, "Well, she's at university and she can't get away." That's what he said, and I accepted it. So yes, that was a very lucky, fortunate thing for me. Well, the amazing thing was we went back to the village, as I said, 50 years after this had occurred, and everybody who was still alive from those days, because remember 50 years on, it's quite a long time since that incident, and they were now getting on, some of them, and there were also the school children who were in a bus just behind the car that I had my parachute enveloped over it, and they all came up to me now in their sort of early 50s of age, and started to tell me stories I never even knew about. For example, the aircraft actually splattered itself with the aircraft we had hit all over the village, and not one single piece of that jet probus or the other jet probus actually hit the village buildings or anything. It all, and it was called the Miracle of Loughborough. And in the churchyard, in the church itself, they showed me a beautiful orange brass plaque with the details of the accident itself and what a miracle it was. So they were celebrating 50 years of a miracle because nobody was hurt.
Wow,
and it was quite an amazing thing,
lucky
actually.
For all parties included.
Yes, absolutely.
So Tim, what aircraft were you assigned to after your basic training?
Well, this is again quite a little story, because I remember now going into my squadron commander's room, and he said, "Sit down, Tim, I've got some news from you, you're posted." And I said, "Come on, sir, it must be Hawker Hunters," because that was what I'd put down as my preference. And normally speaking, as a flying instructor on your first tour, you get your first preference. And he said, no, I'm very sorry that you're going to be posted to a university air squadron to go and fly chipmunks, teaching university air cadets how to fly them. The RAF, want somebody who has been a Cranwell cadet and also a flying instructor to fly and teach these young boys what it's all about. And I said, "You've got to be joking! This is the most terrible news I've ever heard." My face chin must have fallen onto my chest. At any rate, I said, "Well, thank you for the news. I think I'm going to have to obviously try and get this changed." And I walked out the door, and as the door opened the door, there were all the other squadron flying instructors standing there going, "Wah! Gotcha!" And it was a complete joke. And the squadron commander, Keith Beck, said to me, "Come back in here." I said, "No, I'm sorry, I'm having a bit of a joke on you. You're going to be going on to FR10, Fighter Recce Hunters, which of course was the elite in my eyes, and that was the #1 posting which I never thought I'd ever get. So I was over the moon, and I have to say I probably had a lot of beers that night, to say the least.
Brilliant. So Tim, what were your first thoughts of the Hawker Hunter?
Well, it's a dream of mine was to fly the Hawker Hunter, because at that stage it's one of the advanced fighters we had in the Royal Air Force. I knew its role was low level, and therefore that is exactly what I wanted to do. So for me, to eventually get a posting onto Hawker Hunters was the sort of the creme de creme. I wasn't really interested in being air defence and going on the new modern Lightning or anything like that. It was purely to fly that Hawker Hunter.
We have to talk about your first flight in the Hunter. Can you remember that?
I certainly can. More the flight when I had done my dual checkout, which was only 2 sorties, and then I got into a single-seater. Now, all my life I've been dreaming of sitting in a fighter cockpit, strapped in as I am now, close to the sides here, just me and nobody else, because up to now I had not had a single-seat aircraft to fly. And I taxied out at RAF Chivner for my first takeoff in an FGA-6, sorry, and I sat there and I thought, this is it. And I can remember putting on full power, shooting down the runway, and it responded very quickly to my eyes, and then rotating and just climbing. And I sat there as I climbed up through cloud, and I then looked back to find there were no wings either side of me, which I've been used to up to now, and then looked right back and you could see the swept wings, and I realized for the first time I'm in a proper fighter cockpit, and that really was one of the great excitements of my life.
So what was the role of the Hunter at this time?
Well, there were basically 3 roles actually. In those early days there was the air defence role, which was carried out basically in Germany, and then of course the main role was ground attack and also fighter reconnaissance. Those were the 2 principal roles of the Hawker Hunter. Initially I did the full ground attack course, and so I was qualified in ground attack, and then at the end of it all I was then sent off to do the fighter reconnaissance course, which was a very, very demanding course. And bearing in mind that I hadn't flown the Hunter, I was on my first tour, I was one of the very few, and I think there were about 3 or 4 others who preceded me, who had flown fighter reconnaissance before, because normally speaking they took people who'd done at least 2 tours on the Hawker Hunter. So myself and these other chaps just arrived, and we were checked out to become fighter recce pilots on this course, which I found extremely demanding. But once I'd learnt the technique to low level navigate at the standard that's required, I managed to succeed on the course. But the chop rate was around about 50 to 70%, so it's quite a high chop rate.
But what was it like to handle?
Well, people talk very closely about flying the Spitfire being a most beautiful airplane. Well, to be honest with you, in the jet age, I would put the Hawker Hunter in that category. It was a delight to fly, particularly when it had power, hydraulic power, very light on the controls, very light on the elevators, fully controllable. But if you lost the hydraulics, then you went into manual, and it really was then flying like I suppose a heavy aircraft, which but it will still fly and get you back on the ground, which today, of course, if you had total hydraulic failure, you may not be able to get it back and you'd have to jump out, but in those days you could.
So what weapons could it carry at this point?
Well, the initial versions used to carry 1,000-pound bombs, 500-pound bombs, and then practice bombs. It carried eventually the SNEB, the high projectile missile. It also carried a 3-inch rocket with HE head on it, 60-pound head, which was a very, very powerful weapon. It would carry 16 of those. And then, of course, it had 4 Aden guns, 30mm Aden guns, just below me, sitting down here. And when they fired off, you could smell the cornite in the cockpit. It was a tremendous smell, lovely. So those were the main weapons it had.
So how much training did you have before you were posted to Bahrain?
Well, essentially we did the ground attack course, which I think was about 40 to 50 hours, and then the fighter reconnaissance course, which was again about 30 to 40 hours, and then that was me qualified, ready to go out on my first posting. And it really were, as I had qualified as a fighter recce pilot, there were only 3 squadrons in the RAF, number 2, number 4 and number 8, which had been part of 1417 reconnaissance flight from the Aden days. And when Aden came to an end, the 1417 then became B flight of 8 Squadron. So we had the A Squadron was part of the ground attack boys, and then B flight were the fighter Recce boys. So we had a dual squadron, which was rather pleasant.
So what was the role of the hunt out in Bahrain?
Well, depending on which flight you were on, if you were on the fighter Recce flight, our main role there was obviously fighter reconnaissance. And when I say fighter reconnaissance, the aircraft was more than capable of being able to attack the targets, as well as do the fighter reconnaissance itself. So we were there to, if necessary, to go against the borders of the neighbouring countries to Bahrain. Fortunately, we never were called upon to do that, and also at the same time could attack the targets if we felt it relevant to the position. Then on the ground attack side, they themselves also were fully capable of defending whatever the Bahrainis would want us to do, and agreed by the United Kingdom government. So basically they were standing by there to achieve any of the tasks that were set at the time.
How did the hunter cope in them conditions out there?
Well, I thought it coped incredibly well. I mean, with the sand and so on, there's no question about it. You'd see after a few sorties that the leading edge on our wings were cleared of all paint. The front of the drop tanks were cleared, and even sometimes the nose of the aircraft, because the sand actually blasted it off. But the engine itself, the Great Avon, again, I don't remember any occasion where we had a problem with sand ingestion, except for one, whereby when you snap the aircraft into a bank and turn sharply, the aircraft would pitch up, and I remember seeing this happen to this particular pilot, and he jolly nearly went into the sand because he pitched up and managed to control the aircraft and bring it back and said, this aircraft is unbalanced. And after our local test pilot took the aircraft up, he found it did exactly the same, and for the life of them they couldn't think what had happened. And then it was transpired that at the back was a 400-gallon drop tank, a 400-gallon internal tank that they'd been flying empty because it had a problem with it. And whilst it was empty, somehow or rather sand had got inside it. So there was 400 pounds of sand's worth in this rear tank. So the centre of gravity was completely changed. So when it turned and pulled, the whole aircraft snapped up like that. So we were very fortunate to find out what it was, and of course rectified it straight away.
So did you ever conduct any DACT out there?
Yes, we did. If any visiting aircraft came over there that was prepared to do DACT, we would take them on. But I also remember an occasion when the mighty Vulcan came over there, and we were tasked to sort of do some air-to-air photography of them at high level. And I can remember getting up to about 40,000 feet and trying to turn inside this Vulcan, which immediately left me for dead as it turned inside me. So this mighty big bomber at that height, which of course is prime area, was better at turning than the Hunter itself. So the only way I could really attack it probably was to get speed up and then pull up and shoot him down from underneath. But of course I expect they would see that on their early morning radars, and may not have, we may not have got hold of them, but it was a very good combat lesson to learn.
Any memorable stories you can share with us of your time in Bahrain?
Well, I think I can tell you at least 3. One was coming back, and the nose wheel wouldn't lower down, and I landed the aircraft with the nose wheel now stuck up in the nose. And as I touched down and came to halt at the end of the runway, I can remember very clearly, in those days we had the hood would slide back and forth, and of course the hood was closed when I landed, so I unlocked it, and now of course the nose was pointing down like that, and the ground crew or the fire people came along to make sure that the aircraft didn't actually start to ignite, because obviously it'd been rushing along the runway. And this poor little fireman leant over, a Bahraini fireman, and I released the toggle that held the hood there, and of course at that angle I forgot, it just roared down and trapped in here, and all you could see was 2 little legs peering on the side of my aircraft. So that was one incident. The other one was I'd been low flying deep into the empty quarter of the desert, when I noticed that the fuel was getting a bit lower than I thought. So I immediately turned around back towards Bahrain, quite a long way away, and climbed to maximum height. And I was probably cruising at about 33,000 feet. And I was coming over Doha, and I could see Bahrain in the far distance there, when there was an almighty bang, and the engine failed, stopped immediately. And so now I had an aircraft with a dead engine in it, and somehow I thought I can probably glide back to Bahrain. I glid all the way back, and because you normally would hit a high and low key to get into the pattern, I didn't go for that. I went straight for the end of the runway, managed to get the gear down and touch down safely and taxi off the runway. And when the ground crew came out to check my aircraft, there was a hell of a burning smell, and ingested in the cockpit, in the intake, was an enormous vulture. And so this vulture had been flying at that height, 33,000 feet. How it did it, I do not know. And I think it became got in the Guinness Book of Records as being the highest flying bird in those days. Although since then, I think a condor from South America has beaten that record. So it was. So those, and then of course, as inevitable would happen, we got airborne one day, and next minute the fire light came on, and quite often the light would come on and there'd be a false warning, but you didn't know that because unless you can see anything burning. But as I went turned to downwind, the control tower said we can see smoke flaming at the back of you. So as I got to the downwind leg, I closed the throttle right back, turned onto fires and landed and taxied in, and sure enough there had been a fire between the jet pipe and the outer frame of the rear end of the aircraft, and so again, lucky escape. So those are three small incidents that we had out there.
Certainly,
one of many actually.
So Tim, how would you sum up your time in Bahrain?
Well, first of all, I think it was a wonderful training area to learn to fly fighters, because bearing in mind I'd been creamed off. I was a flying instructor in my first tour, and here I was on a fighter outfit, both ground attack, which I did, and I also did the fighter reconnaissance. And so at the end of that tour, I really felt now that I understood how to fly an airplane and also to operate it, which was the most important thing. So to me, it was a great tour. We had a superb squadron commander, and really and truly some great friends there as well. And I felt I was really in the fighter world, which is what it was all about. Right, from Bahrain I was then posted to number 4 Squadron, flying the FR-10 from Royal Air Force Gütersloh, which was only about 110 miles from the inner German border at that stage, which of course was our dividing line. And I did a shortened tour there because 4 Squadron then reconverted to the Harrier, and only 3 of the Hunter pilots went on to the Harrier from there, but I was then retoured at Gütersloh to go on to number 2 Squadron, which is where I completed my Hunter tours in Germany.
So what was the difference between the Recce Hunter and the normal aircraft?
Well, first of all, internally the layout for the FR-10 had a compass that was right up in the front here, as against being down here, which it is in the FGA-9. So the instrumentation was much better and much more accessible because you didn't have a control column blocking off all the instruments which you have to look at here. So to me, the design of the cockpit was much better. Secondly, I don't know whether it was because of the way the nose was shaped, which wasn't quite so blunt because we had a camera in the front of the nose there, that the aircraft flew better than the FGA-9. So for me personally, if I got on the 2 aircraft, I would prefer the FR-10 any day over the FGA-9, which also had a lot of higgledy-piggledy switches with all the weapon switches added into the aircraft, which the FR-10 didn't have, but it still had the 4 guns. So it's still a fairly potent little machine. We had 3 cameras basically, 1 on the port, 1 on the starboard, and 1 in the nose facer. Both the ones on the left and right had a set lens focal length, and the one on the nose had a bit more magnifying, but it was depressed a bit further down than the 2 ones on the side, which went obviously to the photographic unit where they were developed, and then the photographic interpreters would review the film and try to establish where the targets were and so on, which we were going against.
So was this a standard or average day in Germany?
Well, a standard day would start at sort of 7:30 in the morning, down to the squadron by 8 o'clock, met briefing, followed by then the trip of the day, we call it, which meant that we were given a number of targets, which would be static targets, or they could be moving targets, or they could be line searches. Line searches being the most demanding of all the flying we ever did. And that would be over a route of about 1 hour 20 mission. And you then plan those, and then when your slot came up, you went and flew the mission. And you did your targets, and you had to give in-flight reports, write them up, and then obviously have your film developed. And then at the end of the day, we all came into the crew room where all of the photographs were displayed under each pilot, and then they were judged to be who had the best photograph and who had the worst. So we had the pigs of the day for the worst sortie, and obviously the highlight went on to the chap who did the best sortie. So it was but it was very demanding because every day was a competitive day, and nobody wanted to get that pigs, I can assure you. So that was the thing you were trying to avoid.
And would you often get bounced on these sorties?
Yes, in Germany particularly, because in those days you had the 104 aircraft flying, you had the G91s, and then eventually the Phantom came into Germany at the same time. And I can remember myself flying at 250 feet, and suddenly out of nowhere the whole aircraft rattled and shook. And underneath me had flown a 104 going probably twice my speed, because they were, as you know, supersonic. Now that was a clear near miss. Now whether he'd seen me or not, I do not know, but all I can remember is sitting there thinking, my God, that was close. And had it been for real and he had a missile on and he had seen me, well, I never saw him, so he would have had me, unfortunately.
How long were you in Germany before you went back to the UK?
I did very nearly 2.5 years there on the two tours. So, and it was, I think, the most professional flying that I ever did was in those days. Because remember, we didn't have sat navs and all this sort of thing. It was all done purely on map and a stopwatch. I didn't use a stopwatch very much, but otherwise you had to know how to map read. And remember, we were flying normally at about 7 nautical miles to the minute. So and in weather conditions that were, just about suitable for
switched on.
Yeah, switched on. Very demanding. Right, from there, I was posted back to RAF Chibnall, and I was posted immediately onto the weapons instructors course, and I completed and qualified as a weapon instructor. And then I joined number 234 Squadron, where I instructed on all roles from air defence, fighter recce, weaponeering, ground attack, and just general flying. So in all 5 roles, and I can remember my last trip, I did all 5 trips in the last day in all those roles. And when I completed that, I thought to myself, I think I can call myself really an all-round fighter pilot for the very first time. Fabulous.
So I'm going to ask you, what was your favourite role in the Hunter?
It has to be fighter reconnaissance. Although I did have a panache for ground attack with the guns, and was able to get some pretty good scores with the old gun, and so I used to enjoy weaponeering, at ground attack with the gun itself. The bombing was another thing altogether. It wasn't my most favourite, probably because I wasn't the best at it, but certainly in the gunnery I did. But the actual reconnaissance, because it was so demanding, and every time it was assessed, that to me was my favourite role.
How many hours did you get on the Hunter, and can you sum up your time on the day?
I did 2,000 hours on the Hawker Hunter, and I suppose my favourite times would have been in the competitions that we did, particularly when we were flying in things like Royal Flush, and also on an exercise called Big Click, where when I was on II Squadron, we won Big Click against all the other NATO reconnaissance, and so did it on IV Squadron. We won the Royal Flush of that as well. So to become the sort of #1 reconnaissance squadron against all the other NATO was a fabulous achievement. Yeah, fabulous feeling, absolutely fabulous.
The current F-14 Squadron's caliber wings have in stock are VF-142 Ghost Riders and VF-14 Top Hatters. They are both in 72nd scale with a level of detailed experience one would expect on a high quality plastic kit. You can check them out by visiting caliberwings.com. Thank you.
So Tim, in 1975 something else happened to you. Where did you get posted?
That was the time when I'd been posted off the Hawk Hunter and was selected to become a parachutist with the 16 Parachute Brigade. This was something I had not chosen, but I had already done a course when I was around Cranwell deck when I did my 4 little jumps there. And so off I went to join the 16 Parachute Brigade, and I did the full parachute course at RAF Abingdon, and then was trained and then became what is known as a Brigade Air Support Officer, which was the most fascinating 3-year tour with some wonderful soldiers and some great men, and I've never forgotten it.
Why did you get to go to the British Army?
Well, I think what happened was I was going to be Aircrew to Her Majesty the Queen, and when Her Majesty said to me, "Are you going to be a bachelor for the next 3 years?" my answer was, I can't guarantee that, because obviously at this stage I was just coming up to 26 years of age, going bald and pretty ugly, and thought there's no hope that anybody ever want me when I'm now nearly 30 at the end of this tour. And although I was quite prepared to go in as a bachelor, which I was, so anyway, I was obviously ditched, and therefore was no longer going to be her Aircrew. Now the Royal Air Force took a dim view of this, because clearly I'd been selected to represent the Royal Air Force as her Aircrew. And I was called back to MOD, which it's a long story, but I did go and do it. And from then onwards, instead of being promoted, which I thought I would be in that July, I wasn't. So I thought, okay, they're getting their own back on me. And so I then sat back at Chivener, and it wasn't until January, when the January list was coming out, when I got a phone call from the Ministry of Defence saying, we would like to offer you a posting. And the posting was, well, we're going to promote you and you're going to get a flying tour. And I thought, oh, brilliant, I'm going to go on Harriers as a new flight commander. And to cut a long story short, he said, no, you're going to be flying in C-130s. And I said, well, I don't fly trucks. You know, I've been a fighter pilot. And he said, you're going to be jumping out of them. And I said, what are you talking about? And he said, well, we'd like you to become the new Brigade Air Support Officer. And so hence I got that posting, which I thought at the stage was probably a bad boys posting, but actually turned out to be a great tour. Although, of course, I'm one of those very fortunate people who, during this tour, had a parachute jump in which the parachute didn't fully open. It never deployed properly. And I came down from 650 feet. I fell through another man's parachute, which I broke 3 of his main parachute cords and canopies, and landed in the boggiest marsh you can possibly think of in Schleswig-Holstein, and was buried up to my sort of hips in mud. And the chap whose chute I'd gone through also fell a bit quicker than he would normally have done, because obviously I'd broken 3 of his panels, and he pulled me out, and I stood upright, and I realized I wasn't even hurt. And this to me was quite miraculous, because I was very concerned about my feet. I'd been doing a lot of fast bowling at cricket, and I chipped my heel, so this was going to be my first jump, and I was concerned about landing on my feet. Well, of course I never did. I landed on my head. And anyway, to cut a long story short, I did over 100 jumps with the parachute regiment, and yes, I enjoyed it immensely. Very good tour.
You've certainly been a lucky man, let's say that.
Yes, I think certainly some gods were looking after me that day, there's no doubt about it.
So how long did you spend with the British Army?
It was a tour of about 3 years, just short of 3 years. And then I was sent from there to Staff College in India, which again was a bit of a unique, because obviously not too many people getting a posting overseas on their Staff College tour. And so I went to the Indian Defence Services Staff College in the Nilgiri Hills in southern India, which again was a most fascinating year, which I thoroughly enjoyed. The Indians were super people, and anyway, came back from that and was told that I was going to get a Jaguar appointment and be a flight commander on a squadron. and eventually it was to turn out to be Flight Commander number 41 Fighter Recce Squadron, which was just forming because the Jaguar was just coming into service. So the next thing was, of all the courses, to get myself retrained as a pilot again, which meant I had to go and do the basic jet provers course, and then eventually up to, and then the ground attack course, or a bit of a hunter flying, and then back up to Lossiemouth to start the Jaguar operational conversion unit.
So going back a bit, what were your first thoughts of the Jaguar?
Well, when I first saw it, I thought it actually looked a very sharp pointed aircraft, because it is. It's got small wings, long pointed nose, and looked like a really nice airplane. And because it was brand new, the Harrier and the Jaguar, state-of-the-art aircraft with the new inertial systems in it, I was really looking forward to flying it. And so that was it. So I went up there with all expectations of being able to fly it very easily and so on.
So at this point, was it was intended for a trainer, but then is it in 1975 did they decide to go to the bomber?
Yes, it was eventually built as a trainer, but then the Air Force decided to make it into both a ground attack aircraft and a fighter recce aircraft. And again, because of my background, I was posted to the fighter recce side of it. But again, we still had to be qualified in weaponeering and also, of course, photography as well, which we did.
So, can you remember your ground training and how it differed from the Hunter?
Yes, this was a lot more detailed because it was about 2 weeks of ground training, because the aircraft itself actually is quite a complicated aircraft, particularly learning how the fuel system works, the electronic systems, but more importantly, what we call the inertial navigation system, which to me was completely new, and also the head-up displays, which I'd never seen before. And so that required a lot of learning before we actually went out. And I must say the ground score was very good, but it also had an excellent simulator, and it also had in those days the ability to be able to project the ground onto the simulator itself, so you can get sort of some realistic flying as well. Mm-hmm. So I found that to be a very useful model to start flying the Jaguar.
Mm-hmm. And obviously your first flight, I'm guessing you used reheat. This is a bit different compared to the Hunter.
Yes, I mean the Jaguar couldn't get airborne really without reheat, so it was well known for its long length of runway. We had two types of reheat. We had partial throttle reheat, and then we had full reheat, which was both engines in reheat. And yes, it was the first time I'd used reheat. And when you were low flying at, say, 400 knots and you put reheat in there was quite an acceleration. But of course, I'd not experienced it before, and I couldn't compare it with other aircraft. So at the time, it felt, really powerful. Mm-hmm. But when I eventually went through something like the Phantom and the F-16, it didn't feel quite so powerful after that.
So what sort of training sorties would you conduct in the Jaguar?
Well, it was very similar to the Hunter days. I mean, we did a lot of low flying, navigation. We had to do the full weaponeering course, so dropping both bombs and firing the guns. And there was air-to-air combat to do as well, formation flying, and general handling of the aircraft itself. So basically all the roles you required to go into the fighter recce world and the ground attack world.
Mm-hmm. So what was the characteristics of the Jaguar's handling?
Well, this coming off the beautiful Hawker Hunter felt a bit strange, because certainly it when you were in the circuit area to do bumps and touches and go, the aircraft itself used to rumble like hell coming around finals turn, which is something I'd never been used to before, as if you're stalling. So you had to get used to that as well. But once actually low flying or ordinary flying, the aircraft handled pretty well. But again, the turning radius and so on was nowhere near the same as a Hunter.
No.
But nevertheless, after a while, it was a delight to fly, particularly at low level, because it had these special, I think they're called spoilers actually, which came up and kept the aircraft really low level and in all turbulence. So it used to feel like you're going on a railway line. You go drrrn, drrrn, and these things kept flicking it up and down. And so as a low-level platform, it was very, very stable.
Yeah.
And I think that was the great advantage of that aircraft over many others.
Would you say that's where its main role was?
Yes, without a shadow of a doubt. Mm-hmm. It also can go pretty quickly at low level. I mean, you could do certainly 500 knots with no problems at all, and you've got the reheat, but it used up the fuel to accelerate as well. But because you hung things underneath the wings like fuel tanks and so on, that tended to reduce the top speed you can to achieve.
So how did you find the cockpit coming from the Hunter?
Well, it was slightly larger than the Hunter cockpit. and the ergonomics were also better because obviously it'd been thought out properly by the experts up at RAF Wharton. And I think the display for the head-up display, which was something meant all instruments were on your screen there, plus the nice circular navigational map with a beautiful display of the map on there, allowed us to fly the aircraft with complete freedom and look out and so on. So in most respects, first class.
You mentioned 41 Squadron was your first squadron, so what was the role of 41 at this time?
41 was basically a fighter reconnaissance squadron, and also because it was fighter reconnaissance, it did both ground attack and also reconnaissance. It was based at RAF Coldershore. It was the first of or the second one of the two fighter recce squadrons, the first one being number II Squadron in Germany, and then 41. And our main role was to operate in the northern climes of Norway. So we did a lot of flying over in Norway itself, up and down the inner German border, and the border between us and really the Russians and the Finns. And so, a demanding role again.
Mm-hmm. So do you think the Jaguar was the right aircraft for this time in the squadron?
Yes, without a doubt. Although later on, when the Phantom came in, that was probably a much better platform for doing reconnaissance because it could do night reconnaissance as well. Now, in those early days, we didn't do night reconnaissance because it was a single-seat aircraft. It didn't have the equipment required to fly low level at night. Didn't have an autopilot or anything like that. So it was basically an all-day, low-level airplane for reconnaissance and ground attack. And in that role, I can't really fault it. The only thing was that in order to get the cameras on board, we had to carry this enormous centerline reconnaissance pod, which completely changed the handling characteristics of the aircraft. And you had to be very, very careful when you were coming in to brake into the circuit at lower speed that the aircraft didn't actually flick the airplane itself. So you had to be very... But after a while, when you got used to flying with it, it didn't seem to be a hurdle. But of course, being with that weight, it meant longer takeoffs. And also, if you were in combat, there's no question you couldn't fight against another Jaguar that would say was clean against your one with this great big centerline pod. They eventually did change it into a much more modern one after my time, but that was a bit of a letdown on the aircraft itself.
And was it still the same wet film as the Hunter?
No, this. What am I saying? Yes, it did have the wet film in it, but it also had infrared line scan as well.
Okay.
So that's the first time we were having that, which was a useful addition to the aircraft itself.
Mm-hmm. So how long did you spend on 41?
I did very nearly 3 years on that squadron. Flew 1,000 hours as a flight commander, and then I left there to do a couple of not ground tours, but a couple of courses I had to go and do, and then was told I'd been given command of number II Squadron in Germany, which of course was absolute delight to me, going back to Germany and to my old squadron number 2. So yes, I smiles all round, fabulous.
So you talk about Germany there. Was II Squadron the same as 41 Squadron in the role?
Yes, exactly the same role, except Germany, we were obviously flying against the inner German border. It was also at the height of the Cold War at that stage, so there was tremendous demand on us to be ready at instant notice to go to war, and so all our training was developed to do just that very thing. And we were, what we call tactically evaluated very regularly. The squadron operated from hardened aircraft shelters, which we didn't have at RAF Coldershore, and so that meant another different way of operating. And we were always in hardened bunkers most of the time. So whereas the 41 Squadron just had an ordinary crew room to operate out of. So operationally, it was much more operational in that sense to fight a war. And indeed, I'm proudly say that number II Squadron, I think, was one of the very first Jaguar squadrons to achieve straight 4-1 grades in the tactical evaluation. So, yes, we're very more than capable.
So what was it like going back to Germany in the Jaguar? Obviously, you came from the Hunter in the same squadron.
Yes, it was different because we were based at RAF Larbrook, which had 3 other Buccaneer squadrons flying there from there, plus ourselves. So we had a single-seat squadron, and then for the first time ever, really, for me at any rate, based with people who had navigators on board.
Yes.
So we met them at Larbrook, and mostly in the bar, of course. And the Buccaneer was a very able machine and did a fabulous role. And But Germany is Germany, and if you like Germany, which I certainly do, then it was a fabulous posting, really was.
So what different aircraft were you getting bounced by coming from the Hunter to the Jag now?
Well, now of course the Phantom had come in, and that was always a large challenge. The 104 was just being phased out, and then of course the F-16 was coming in, and there's no doubt about it, the F-16 was way above us when it came to air-to-air combat or bouncing us. But the great thing about the Jaguar was you could really fly it very fast and very low. And I like to think that if someone did get behind you and you hadn't seen them, because you're flying like that, it made it very difficult for the opponent to knock you down. So in that sense, but then if you tactically flew, you hoped you'd pick him up before he got in behind you. But now with all the new radar systems they have, it's a different ball game altogether.
So what was the atmosphere like in Germany at this point?
Well, we knew we had a very special war role. It was important. The social side had never changed. There's plenty of good beer calls, and there was lots of fun to have at weekends and so on. But you were on duty, ready to go to war as soon as that hooter blew. So again, you tend to keep yourself ready for it. We didn't have to do as the Buccaneers did, because they were carrying nuclear weapons. We didn't have to do a sort of 5-minute readiness and stay on cue. That was the one advantage of being on the Recce Squadron. But when the hooter blew, the squadron would be there and we would be manned within a few minutes, not long at all.
And did you feel the Jaguar was right for this environment?
Well, in those days, that aircraft was exceptionally good again at low level, and using the new inertial navigation systems, which had been updated quite a lot from when I first flew it on 41, was a tremendous asset to us, because you could now have some more time looking out at the cockpit rather than reading your map, because the inertial system was taking you there. I still always flew with a map because I couldn't get rid of that because I've been trained on it. But yes, it was a very competent aircraft. In visibilities and weather-wise, well, obviously it's not like the Tornado, which was obviously all-terrain following radar on there, but we didn't have that. But most of us who'd been skilled on Hunters in Germany didn't find it too much of a problem flying in the poor weather, which we flew in very regularly.
So our viewers always like to know, do you have any stories you can share from your time in the Jaguar? Just a few memorable ones like you said on the Hunter.
Well, interesting you say that, because the other day I was asked, are there any stories I could talk about on the Jaguar? And to be honest with you, I don't think we actually had any. Well, when I was in command of II Squadron, certainly in that 3 years there, we had just a couple of small instances. Other than that, we had a relatively free run, and no pilot was ejected or was killed or injured, or an incident which was got the remarks of the Commander-in-Chief. So in my case, there aren't any stories to tell, other than we did one small thing at Lossiemouth on a detachment when one of the aircraft wouldn't start because the battery was flat. So the pilot decided, I wasn't there with him, but he went out, jumped out of his aircraft and went over and changed his battery with the one next door. And when the battery was connected, he was upstairs in the undercarriage by the nose wheel, and the doors closed on him and trapped him under here and dropped him out again, and it didn't hurt his ribs badly, and that caused a bit of furore with the station commanders and so on. But other than that small incident, nobody was really hurt and no damage was done to the aircraft. Perhaps we should have used an engineer, but there weren't any engineers available at that stage. So that's the only incident I can think of that really occurred on the squadron.
It's probably a good thing.
I think it was actually, yes.
So how many hours did you get on Jaguars, and did you enjoy your time?
Yes, I did 1,000 hours as a flight commander and 1,000 hours as a squadron commander, plus of course the OCU hours. So in the end I achieved well over 2,000 hours on the Jaguar itself. So lucky boy.
Very lucky. So Tim, can you tell us what happened after your time on the Jaguar?
Yes, after the Jaguar tour itself, I then was posted to the Ministry of Defence for a period of time which lasted 3 years. It sounded like a black tunnel to me, and eventually the white light started to appear as the years went by, and then I was told that I was going to get a station, and I went to Royal Air Force College Cranwell, which was a flying training school, big one, and became the station commander there, which I did for very nearly 2.5 years, and then was short toured to go back to the headquarters of Headquarters Support Command at RAF Brampton. And that's where I then started to do a ground tour as the group captain in charge of all flying training in the RAF, which included the Hawks at RAF Valley, the Red Arrows, and also obviously the basic training aircraft that were in the command at the time.
So what was it like flying with the Reds then?
Well, of course, I didn't go in the front seat on these ones. I was obviously in the back seat, although occasionally they would let me have their aircraft to go fly, which I flew very regularly. But yes, I mean, as a fighter pilot, I spent a lot of time doing close formation flying, and most of the guys on there had all been on fighter squadrons at any rate. So, but what I did find was that first of all, the discipline was very high indeed. Secondly, the skill which they exhibited. Thirdly, I began to realise, having done quite a lot, that actually just hanging onto someone's wing all the time wasn't necessarily the most interesting thing I've ever done. But nevertheless, when you're part of a great elite team such as the Red Arrows, yes, a great thrill.
Mm-hmm. So you also managed to train on the Phantom and Tornado. How did this happen?
Well, eventually I was promoted to air rank and went out to Germany as a senior air staff officer in Germany, which meant I had responsibility for obviously all the aircraft that we had in Germany, both at RAF Bruggen, RAF Wildenrath and RAF Larbruck. Those were the three main stations. And when I first got out there, the Phantom was still flying at RAF Wildenrath. And very kindly, the station commander had allowed me to come and fly the Phantom. So I got checked out with the Phantom, although I never did the full ground school or that, and eventually was sent solo in the Phantom. So I was allowed to fly that, and I probably did about 30 hours flying the Phantom itself.
So how did that? Did you find that compared to the Jag?
Well, first of all, it is enormous cockpit compared with the Jaguar, and being American, quite different in certain respects. The other thing I noticed particularly is that when it's flying along, it tends to porpoise a little bit like this, and that actually is a strange feeling, particularly when you're flying at medium level to high level, as I did. I remember flying across to RAF Lossiemouth from Germany, thinking this thing is porpoising all over the place. But it was such a powerful machine, and you could see that to me it was one of the great war fighting machines that we had at the time.
Of course, yeah. So could you talk us through your final tour from 93 to 95?
Yes, again, when I finished my Sasso tour, I can remember now the Air Marshal in charge of postings came out to see us and came into my office and said, "We have a new posting for you. We're thinking that because of your background of parachuting and so on, that you would be an excellent chap to take over the Royal Air Force Regiment as its new Commandant General." And I thought, well, that sounds very nice, because I know it was a 2-star appointment, so it meant I was going to be promoted. And then he suddenly said, "No, I'm sorry, Tim, it's going to be the first of the 1-star appointments." So at any rate, I accepted. Obviously I had to accept the tour, and so I joined the Royal Air Force Regiment. And for 3 years, operating from out of RAF Headquarters Strike Command, I spent a lot of time going out in the fields with the chaps. I also parachuted with them as well, and with number II Squadron, and felt it was probably one of the most enjoyable tours, because the regiment itself, despite what all the other people used to say, rock apes and so on, they're not like that. They're intelligent, they're extremely well disciplined, and I found them some of the best officers I came across in the Royal Air Force were the Royal Air Force Regiment officers. So I haven't got a bad word to say about them.
So if you can you sum up your overall RAF career?
Well, I think it's been very varied, very interesting, with lots of incidents, survivals. I'm sometimes known as 9 lives, and survived all those. So yes, I would say that it was most enjoyable. And then to cap it all, when I left and joined the civilian world, I then became an RAF reservist and flew with the the Air Experience flight of number 6 at RAF, initially at Abingdon, and then we moved to Benson. So I did another 10-15 years flying until the stage where the RAF said, "Sorry, you're too old," and they kicked me out, unfortunately, and that was the end of it.
So can you briefly tell us what happened after your RAF career?
Yes, I very fortunately got a job as the head of security for De Beers. I didn't realise at the time that I was applying for De Beers, but anyway, after a while, after many interviews, such as 4 interviews, and one having a dinner with the board in the Recce Hotel with my wife, I was then appointed as the head of all security operations for De Beers worldwide. So I had responsibilities particularly of those operations in Africa, from Sierra Leone to Guinea, right down to Zaire, now the Democratic Republic of Congo, Angola, etc., all the way around there, and then into Russia, Hong Kong, and we didn't go to Canada, but we eventually bought a set of mine up there as well. So most of the time was trying to stop people from stealing diamonds, and I like to think we were
very James Bond.
Yes, it was very James Bond, and very exciting periods, because I was deeply involved with the Millennium robbery in the Dome in 2000, in which they tried to steal what is quoted as being $350 million worth of diamonds.
Wow.
And with the police, the flying squad, who were quite excellent, we managed to catch all the robbers who were trying to do it. Took a long time, nearly a year's worth of planning by them and attempts. So it was very successful, and I haven't forgotten that either.
Brilliant. And do you have any hobbies, Tim?
Yes, I've always been very interested in birds, butterflies and moss. Mainly because when I was in the Sudan, my father was keen on it, and so I took on that habit, and I still do to this day. I'm always watching out for the various types of birds, or seeing what butterflies are flying around, and generally speaking, I can remember their names as well. So that was really one of my main hobbies. The second one, I was quite keen in the early days of making aero models. Not very good at it, but I stopped that quite early on, unfortunately, when I joined the RAF itself, because there wasn't enough time. And then I suppose most of my hobbies have been playing sport, because I'm a very keen sportsman.
This could be a difficult one. Favourite aircraft you've flown?
Well, to be honest with you, is the F-16. I had about 10 to 12 rides in an F-16, and to me that is the most magnificent airplane that I've ever flown in those days. And I still think it's a great machine even to this day. I shall never forget the very first flight in it, in which the instructor who was sitting behind me said, you see where that little cross is? Well, look at where it is on the end of the taxiway. And we flew the whole mission, which included just about everything you can do with a fighter airplane. And when we landed back, he said, where is that cross pointing? I said, it's about 2 inches from where we started off from. He said, there you are, that's how good the system is in this aircraft. Whereas in the Jaguar, it would have probably been about 2 miles down the right. So, fabulous.
What nation was that with?
That was for the United States.
The US?
Yes, US.
Brilliant. A plane you wish you could have flown?
I think if I could be honest, truthful with you, the F-15E model, which is the low-level ground attack strike aircraft, that is one hell of a beast. I mean, it knocked the patch off a Tornado.
Oh, yes.
But unfortunately, we didn't have them in the Royal Air Force. Although I did fly the F-15, I did about 3 sorties with them.
Oh, wow.
And I always remember then thinking what a big aircraft this was. It isn't quite the same as in a F-16, which had a lovely little bubble cockpit. But nevertheless, it's still what I would think is a fighting machine.
Probably still better than our Air 3s.
I think so, yes. I do, honestly.
So finally, Tim, do you ever get sick of talking about aviation?
No. I think the thing about aviation is that it's the people who are in the aviation. You saw when I first arrived here today, 2 old muckers who I hadn't seen since a long, long time suddenly come up and introduce themselves to me, and I immediately recognised both of them. That's what flying is all about. So, and of course we all have common stories, and it's always about aviation. We don't talk about much else. So no, I'll never stop talking about aviation.
Well, Tim, thanks very much for being on the show.
It's my pleasure.